He went to look for Otis and pushed his way into the dark inn with Jester at his heels. The atmosphere was choking with smoke and stuffiness. In a corner by the roaring fire, red-faced musicians and sailors, entwined with young women, jigged and sang, glad to be on dry land after months at sea. Others played cards, and in a further room serious gambling was going on. Meshach squinted through the haze, and at last discovered his father deep in conversation with a naval man. These days, Otis made more from selling boys onto the ships than anything else. They would sell the 3 older boys he had just brought in. Meshach managed to squeeze himself onto the bench next to Otis, who grabbed a passing barmaid. "Hey, darling!" He pulled her down on his knee, causing ale to splash out of the 4 tankards she was carrying, 2 in each hand. "Now look what you made me do," she giggled. As it was Otis, she wasn't cross. "Good to see you, Otis," she purred. He burrowed into her neck and then murmured, "Is Mrs. Peebles in her parlour?" The barmaid tut-tutted with exaggerated disappointment and wriggled off his knee. "Why is it you always fancy her more than me?" she pouted. "'Cause she's prettier." He slapped her bottom and they both laughed. "She's back there. Shall I tell her you're here?" "Do that, my sweet, and while you're about it, bring me and the boys some ale and meat." "Hello, Meshach," she purred, tweaking his chin before weaving her way through the crowd and disappearing into the kitchen. It was an hour later, after Meshach and Otis had drunk several pints of ale and consumed a full plate of meat and potatoes and dumplings, when the barmaid came and said Mrs. Peebles would see him. Otis got to his feet, and like shadows, Meshach and Jester followed him through the dense crowd and out of a far door which led into a dark, narrow passageway at the back. It was instantly chillier, and Meshach shivered. He knew Mrs. Peebles' parlour. Whenever they passed through Gloucester, Otis always called in. Otis reached her door and was about to knock when it opened. A woman holding a flickering taper stood in the doorway taking her leave. Meshach gawped up at her. She was not young, and the bright colours of her clothes, her body squeezed in at the waist and bodice, her flounced-up hair and rouged face, were all part of an effort to knock a decade off her age. "Ah, yes, Lady Philomena," she spoke in a heavy, confidential way. "Now that young woman is one to watch, Mrs. Peebles, you mark my words. There's powerful talk of things going on up at the house with the tutor, a German, you know, and—" The woman stopped abruptly. "What are you staring at, you insolent pup?" she said sharply, pushing Meshach away. But then she saw Otis standing there, a slight smile on his face. She held her taper up as if to see him better. The shadows wavered around them, encircling the flame. "Oh, it's you," she simpered. "The boy's got bigger. I didn't recognize him. I think you have a visitor, Mrs. Peebles," she called over her shoulder. "Good to see you, Otis. I hope you're keeping in good health. Will you be coming up to Ashbrook this time? We could do with our knives sharpening and a few new pots, perhaps." The woman in the doorway tipped her head flirtatiously. "Nothing would keep me away, Mrs. Lynch." "Good night, Mrs. Peebles," Mrs. Lynch called out, without taking her eyes off Otis. "See you in the morning." As she sidled past, Meshach shrank back in case he received another blow, and watched her go, looping her skirts over her free arm as she climbed the narrow winding stairs to the bedrooms above the inn. "Sleep well, Mrs. Lynch," answered Mrs. Peebles from within. "Mrs. Peebles," Otis greeted her from the doorway, leaning nonchalantly, one arm up against the lintel as if he held it up. Meshach peered beneath his father's arm into the parlour beyond, where a lady draped in a veil sat at a round table. No one crossed Mrs. Peebles. She had been born nothing but a bargee's daughter, no education, no position, but she had such intelligence, such a snake-like ability to target a person's weaknesses, such an ear for gossip, scandal, and innuendo, that people feared her. It was said she had been employed as a spy in her youth, when she was beautiful and able to mix with company, especially the foreigners who came through the city, and was clever enough to entrap or compromise anyone targeted by her paymasters. Now she wasn't beautiful. Although she was old enough to be Meshach's grandmother, it wasn't age which had spoilt her looks, but smallpox. He sensed his father wince and drop his eyes as she pulled her veil across her ravaged, pitted face. Pushing Meshach into a corner to sit and wait, Otis strode towards her, smiling that restrained half-smile, which usually did more to soften the hearts of women than the effusive lace-handkerchief-sweeping charm of so many men trying too hard to please. He knew she despised them anyway, for if it's one thing a woman with such a disability can cut through with a knife, it's cant and false flattery. He kissed her hand. She waved him to sit down opposite her. The double candlestick with its broad flapping flame favoured him, while leaving her in a kind shadow from which she could scrutinize her visitor without effort. Meshach settled on the floor with his arms clasped round Jester. The ale had made him sleepy. "What about him?" Mrs. Peebles indicated Meshach. "No need to trouble yourself. His body's got bigger, but his brain is still as soft as it always was. He won't say anything." Meshach knew that his father and Mrs. Peebles had been doing business together since before he was born. Otis had just been a lad when she spotted him. He was born a wheeler-dealer, already knowing how to make himself useful, dependable, and indispensable. She took him on as a boy and liked to think she turned him into a man, the kind of man she could use and control. She liked to gather young men around her, those she felt she could groom and manipulate and trust to get involved in her various enterprises. "I hear they've given you a new name," she said, pouring out some gin from a large earthenware jug. "Potts man, charity man, even Mrs. P's man. So? What's in a name?" He shrugged. "They're calling you a Coram man. What's that?" Meshach looked up. How did she know? He himself had only heard it for the first time today by the river. Otis shrugged. "Come on, Otis, don't play coy with me. What does it mean?" demanded Mrs. Peebles. Her eyes gleamed at him with intense curiosity. "What have you been up to that I don't know about?" "Nothing that you don't know about, Mrs. P." Otis leant back, still smiling. "It's the same old business. Brats. Just another angle. Haven't you heard of Coram?" "I know of a Thomas Coram, the sea captain. I thought he was in America. Came this way sometimes. Didn't have anything on him, though. Clean as a whistle. Do you mean him?" "Look, Mrs. P," said Otis, leaning forward conspiratorially. "I think I may have hit on something good, something which can benefit us both, if we cooperate." "You have always cooperated with me in the past," muttered Mrs. Peebles. "Are you asking me to cooperate with you?" She cackled scornfully. "Suit yourself. Yes, it is Captain Coram. He's in London now, given up seafaring and turned to good works. He's something of a benefactor." There was derision in his tone as Otis said, "Wants to save the poor children of England. He's set up a hospital, an institution for foundlings. But I tell you something, it's not just the poor children he's saving, but the brats of the rich. Word has spread about the thousands of pounds being poured into his enterprise to feed, clothe, and educate bastards. Thousands, Mrs. P. Money coming from the wealthy to salve their consciences and purchase their respectability. I saw it for myself. I was in London last year. I saw the rich carriages, the fine weeping ladies hiding their faces behind Spanish lace veils, leaving their illegitimate babies in satin-lined baskets with a pouch of gold coins tucked under the pillows. Otis, I say to myself, if there's not something to be gained in all this for me, I'll eat my hat." "So, have you turned this to your advantage?" inquired Mrs. Peebles softly. "Blackmail?" "That, and other sidelines." He took another swig of gin straight from the jug. "You know things develop for themselves if you let them. I've been developing my sidelines." Mrs. Peebles leant forward into the light. "Tell me more." Meshach's head lolled as he drifted into sleep. He thought about Captain Thomas Coram, a charity man like his father. Loves little children. His brain filled with images, dreams overwhelmed him. He saw angels and children soaring among the stars, but he was drowning, and as he drowned he called out, "Save me! Save me!" But no one heard him. Then there came a great galleon with billowing sails tossed in an ocean of sky and clouds. Meshach could see the outline of a captain at its helm. "Save me! Save me!" he yelled. But his voice was lost in a chorus of singing angels and children, their voices mingling with the gulls as he sank down, down beneath the waves. He awoke suddenly, just when he thought he had drowned. Jester had jumped to his feet, his body taut, his fur raised, his ears pricked, and he whined softly between bared teeth. Meshach looked round. The room was empty, the candle almost out. His father and Mrs. Peebles had gone. In the pre-dawn darkness, when most of the city was finally silent, even the people of the night were subdued. The gambling had ceased, the drunkards were asleep, the servants, lackeys, labourers, and traders had all surrendered their limbs and brains to the secret world of the unconscious. Only sailors watched for the dawn tide were up. Only sailors watching for the dawn tide were up, and the night watchmen huddled near fires in between doing their rounds. They could be heard whistling at regular intervals all over the city, or calling out the time on the hour to reassure their employers that they were still alert and that all was well. One of the inn dogs started to bark frantically. It set off the other dogs, including Jester. His fur bristled all along his spine. "Hush, boy, hush!" Meshach clamped a hand over his muzzle. Wide awake now, keeping his hand over the dog's mouth, Meshach staggered to his feet. He should check the mules and the wagon. He peered out into the yard. The wind buffeted a lantern hanging from a hook, causing shadows to swing like a ship tossing at sea. Then, from an upstairs window, he saw another light, a steady flame which lit up the pale face of Mrs. Lynch peering out into the night. Meshach thought she would close her window and return to bed, but she didn't. She seemed to be observing something going on in the lane which only she could see from upstairs. Curious, Meshach wandered across the yard with Jester padding silently beside him. He pushed open a door in the wall and stepped into a side lane. In the clouded moonlight, he dimly perceived a small carriage harnessed to a single white horse. He glanced up and saw that Mrs. Lynch was watching it too. The cathedral clock had just tolled 4. Someone moved out of the shadows carrying a low light. It was the cloaked figure of a woman. Could it be Mrs. Peebles? He edged closer. Certainly it was roughly her height. The carriage door opened and the woman went forward. Meshach couldn't see who was inside. All he saw by the light of the lantern was a basket being passed out. The hands that gave the basket stayed outstretched, the empty fingers seeming unsure. Then abruptly they were withdrawn and the carriage door was slammed shut, and Meshach glimpsed the coat of arms of a leaping deer entwined in letters he couldn't read. The figure turned away with the basket as the carriage moved off swiftly. Meshach pressed himself hard up against the wall, hugging Jester into silence as Mrs. Peebles hurried past him. Then the tavern dog stopped barking and the lane was empty again. The transaction lasted a minute. Meshach looked up again at the window, but it was closed. He tapped his thigh softly, "Come on, Jester," and went back to finish the night in the stables. Meshach had been dead asleep when he was awoken by a fierce kick. "Get up, damn you!" snarled Otis. He looked red-eyed and short of sleep himself. "We've got to get rid of these brats before we take on any more. Get 'em up." Meshach got the children up, snivelling and sniffing with anxiety, afraid what was going to happen to them. He took them into the yard. Otis had already got the mule harnessed up to the wagon. "Get 'em inside," he snarled. Meshach bundled them in, and Jester too, then went over to the pump to drink and splash his face. As he did, Mrs. Peebles and Mrs. Lynch passed each other in the yard. "What the deuce was all that about in the lane last night? It wasn't you, was it?" It was you, wasn't it?" he heard Mrs. Lynch say. "Out there in the lane last night?" Mrs. Peebles stopped short. She looked hard at Mrs. Lynch, paused for a split second, and said without batting an eyelid, "Not me, dearie. I was tucked up and dead to the world all night." Meshach saw the brief pause and thought, "She's lying. I wonder why." Mrs. Lynch saw too, but decided she would bide her time. If there was anything important to learn, she would find it out.